Man saves dying, polar bear. What happens next leaves everyone stunned. In the frozen expanse of the Arctic tundra, where the wind howls like a lonely wolf and the ice stretches to the horizon, a single moment of compassion can ignite the brightest spark of hope. This is the extraordinary tale of a man named James McAllister, who risked everything to save a dying polar bear. In that heart-stopping moment, James discovered that the bonds we forge with nature can transcend fear and reshape destiny. So bundle up for the journey ahead, because what happened after James extended his hand to that majestic creature will leave you speechless and change you forever. James McAllister had always been drawn to the quiet power of the natural world. Even as a child growing up in Vancouver, he preferred the hush of an old-growth forest over the bustle of city streets. He would beg his parents to take him camping in the Canadian Rockies, where he could fall asleep to the lullaby of whispering pines and wake up to the crisp morning air. As he grew older, that fascination evolved into a deep respect for wilderness and a desire to protect it. After graduating from the University of British Columbia with a degree in environmental science, James found himself working for various conservation organizations, but he never lost his childhood longing for immersion in the wild. It was that yearning that brought him to Churchill, Manitoba, a place often called the polar bear capital of the world. When he first stepped off the small propeller plane onto the icy tarmac, the biting wind cut through his layers of thermal clothing, reminding him that he was a visitor in this remote realm. Churchill, perched on the southwestern shore of Hudson Bay, greeted him with frosty air and a sense of solitude. He was there to conduct field research on the region's changing ice patterns, but deep down, he also nurtured a private hope to witness polar bears in their natural habitat, living symbols of Arctic majesty. He had no idea how profoundly one such bear would alter his life. The first few weeks of James's stay were busy with data collection and documentation. In partnership with the Canadian Wildlife Federation, he monitored sea ice thickness, tracked seasonal melt patterns, and recorded sightings of wildlife. Each day, he would load his camera, a Nikon Date 150 that had been a gift from his parents, and trek out into the frigid landscape to capture the subtle changes in the ice. Nights were spent huddled in a small research station, inputting his findings into a laptop and discussing them over staticky radio communications with colleagues hundreds of miles away. Despite the starkness of the Arctic environment, James felt an inexplicable warmth whenever he saw a polar bear in the distance. The bears roamed the ice like cautious monarchs, dignified yet wary, scanning the bleak horizon for signs of seals or possible threats. Their sheer size was awe-inspiring, but what truly struck James was their calm, almost meditative presence in a place that demanded constant vigilance for survival. On rare occasions, he would glimpse a mother and her cubs, or a large male ambling alone, but he maintained a respectful distance. As mesmerizing as they were, polar bears were apex predators and not to be trifled with. Danger, as he well knew, lurked beneath their regal beauty. One early morning, before the sun could fully illuminate the horizon, James set out on his snowmobile to check a cluster of ice ridges where polar bears were sometimes seen hunting. The temperature hovered around -30 degrees Celsius, and each exhalation formed a cloud of vapor that drifted away like a ghost. Drifts of powdery snow formed miniature dunes along the frozen bay, and the sky itself was a pale lavender slowly transitioning to soft pink. It was during this ride that a flash of movement caught his eye. At first, it appeared to be just another polar bear, head hung low in search of prey. But something about the bear's gait was off. It staggered, stumbling through the snow with an unsteady determination. As James carefully approached, cutting the engine some distance away to avoid spooking it, He noticed the bear's gaunt frame. Its fur seemed lackluster, and the once powerful muscles were replaced by protruding ribs. Streaks of red stained the snow behind it, as if it were leaving a trail of pain. His heart clenched at the sight. A sense of helplessness washed over him because he knew that in nature's harsh economy, many animals succumbed to injury or starvation. But something urged him to investigate further. He parked the snowmobile at a safe distance and slowly approached on foot. Every survival instinct screamed at him to remain cautious. Polar bears, even those that appear weak, are not to be underestimated. One swipe of a massive paw could end a life in an instant. James had bear spray and a flare gun, standard protocol in these parts, but he never wanted to use them. Step by step, he closed the distance, letting the wind carry his scent away from the bear to avoid startling it. His heart hammered against his chest, each beat echoing in his ears like a warning drum. Finally, he could see the bear more clearly. Its eyes were half closed, and it was breathing in ragged, uneven gasps. A deep gash ran across its right flank, possibly from a confrontation with another bear or a desperate scuffle over scarce food. The wound was clotted with frozen blood, partially covered by ice crystals. It looked infected. James knew that in the wild, such an injury could be a death sentence if left untreated. The bear's front paws trembled, either from exhaustion or intense pain. He was torn between the stark reality of letting nature take its course and the impossible thought of intervening. In that pivotal moment, James recalled a conversation he'd had with an Inuit elder in town, a man named Noah Kapik, who had once told him that all living things in the Arctic are kin by necessity. "We rely on each other out here, man and beast alike," Noah had said, his wizened face etched with lines of countless winters. "Sometimes, what we do for one another is what keeps our world in balance." James knew he wasn't a veterinarian, nor was he equipped for large-scale animal rescue. But he also couldn't simply stand by and watch the bear suffer. His mind raced, searching for any feasible plan. He had a first aid kit, but it was designed for humans, not for a 1,000-pound predator. Despite that, he decided he had to try. The moral compulsion felt as cold and sharp as the Arctic wind itself, slicing through the usual barriers of fear and caution. Yes, this was nature's cycle, but he was already a part of that cycle simply by being there, bearing witness. Summoning his courage, James radioed the local wildlife authorities, leaving a hurried message about a wounded polar bear. He didn't expect immediate help. Transporting a bear of that size would be a logistical nightmare. In the meantime, he would do what he could if the bear let him. He approached as slowly as one might approach a wild lion. The bear stirred at his presence, lifting its massive head to regard him with weary eyes. Up close, James could see that the polar bear was dangerously underweight. The collar of fur around its neck seemed thin and patchy, and the skin beneath was an angry red where frostbite had set in. He spoke softly, though he knew the bear couldn't possibly understand his words. Still, the tone might communicate his intentions better than anything else. "Easy there, big guy. I'm just here to help," he whispered, voice trembling from cold and nerves. Reaching into his first aid kit, James pulled out disinfectant wipes and gauze. It was a paltry offering, but better than nothing. He inched closer, keeping eye contact with the bear, whose breathing was shallow. When he was close enough, he began the delicate task of cleaning the wound. Each time he pressed the gauze against the torn flesh, the bear grunted in pain, making James's heart skip a beat. I'm sorry," he murmured, tears forming in his eyes. The moment felt surreal, a lone human in the Arctic, administering first aid to an apex predator. He prayed the bear would sense his compassion rather than see him as a threat or a meal. The initial cleaning was excruciatingly slow, limited by James's numb fingers and the bear's unpredictable responses. Every shudder or twitch of the bear could become lethal if it decided to lash out. Yet, in what felt like a small miracle, the bear remained mostly calm, too drained by starvation and injury to put up much resistance. Occasionally, it let out a low, plaintive moan that caused James's stomach to flip with guilt and desperation. He tried to remain steady, reminding himself that any panic on his part could provoke an attack or worsen the bear's stress. He applied antibiotic ointment, fortunately something he had in his kit, for his own potential injuries, and then used gauze and cloth to bandage the wound as best he could. Each pass of the bandage was a shaky attempt at triage, but it was the only chance this bear might have. If infection spread or the wound tore further, the bear would not survive. Through it all, James was intensely aware that he was bridging an ancient chasm of fear between man and beast. He remembered hearing stories about how polar bears, ironically, seldom fear humans but rather see them as potential prey. Yet at this moment, that primal dynamic was suspended by a fragile thread of trust. By the time James finished, the Arctic morning light had brightened the sky to a pale gold, and the wind had picked up, causing snow to swirl around them. The bear's eyes, still open, seemed a bit clearer than before. James wondered if it was the relief from pain or just a fleeting second wind. The moment felt deeply intimate, as though he were sharing a secret with one of the Arctic's most elusive residents. He gently patted the bear's flank, careful to avoid the bandaged area, and whispered, "Hang in there, buddy." The bear exhaled a steamy breath that drifted between them. He realized with a sinking feeling that the bear needed nourishment and a secure place to rest. The nearest wildlife facility was miles away, and there was no straightforward way to transport a polar bear that might weigh anywhere from 700 to 1,000 pounds. Even if a rescue team arrived, sedation would be necessary, carrying the risk of complications in the bear's weakened state. James's mind spun with possibilities. Could he lead the bear closer to town? That seemed dangerous for everyone involved. Could he set up some kind of temporary shelter here on the ice? The idea seemed equally far-fetched. He decided to radio back and see if any help was coming. Back at his snowmobile, James grabbed the radio handset, his teeth chattering partly from cold and partly from adrenaline. He reiterated his coordinates and stressed the urgency of the situation. The dispatcher on the other end sounded empathetic but non-committal. They were short-staffed and had multiple calls about bears wandering near town. They would do what they could, they said, but no promises. James felt a tremor of frustration as he placed the radio back. He glanced at the dying polar bear, which had lain back down and was breathing shallowly, its eyes drooping. Time was short. The bear might slip away long before any help arrived. In a moment of impulsive compassion, James removed the small insulated lunchbox he carried with him. Inside, he had a few energy bars and a sealed package of smoked salmon, a treat he'd brought along for a snack. Though uncertain about the specifics of a polar bear's diet beyond seal meat and occasional scavenging, James reasoned that some calories were better than none. He carefully approached the bear again and laid the salmon a short distance away, speaking in soothing tones. The bear sniffed the air, lifted its head with noticeable effort, and slowly inched forward. It devoured the salmon in a matter of seconds. That tiny spark of appetite gave James a glimmer of hope. Over the next few hours, James alternated between standing guard by the bear and collecting additional supplies from his snowmobile. He fashioned a windbreak using a spare tarp and some stakes, creating a meager shield against the biting gusts. The bear lay there, occasionally lifting its head, its breathing uneven but steady. James offered small rations of anything that might provide sustenance, bits of jerky, protein bars, and even some sardines from an emergency ration kit. It was unorthodox, but the bear seemed willing to take what was offered. Each time James approached, He did so with painstaking caution, maintaining eye contact and speaking softly. The boundary between them was a precarious one misinterpretation by the bear, one primal surge of instinct, and James could pay with his life. He felt a potent mix of awe and terror. Here was a creature capable of tearing seals apart with ease, and yet it was now in a state of such fragility that it was reduced to scavenging from a human's meager lunch. The experience tapped into some deep, primal recognition of the interconnectedness of all life. The Arctic, with its raw, demanding conditions, was a place where vulnerabilities were laid bare both for humans and for the apex predators who ruled this icy domain. Eventually, the sky darkened, heralding the long Arctic night. James knew it would be dangerous to remain out on the ice after sunset, but he couldn't bear the thought of leaving the wounded bear entirely alone. He radioed again to see if any rescue was imminent, but the dispatch offered only apologies and said they might be able to send someone by the following morning. Frustration gnawed at him. That might be too late. Setting aside his hesitation, James decided to make camp near the bear. He pitched a small expedition tent a cautious distance away, ensuring that if the bear decided to wander or attack, he would have a few precious seconds to react. He built a small fire within a protective ring of rocks, hoping the flames would provide both warmth and a deterrent for other predators. Through all these preparations, he kept glancing at the bear, whose breathing had become even more labored in the frigid evening air. In that lonely Arctic twilight, the silhouette of man and bear, both battered by the elements, spoke volumes about the harshness and fragility of life up north. James felt a pang of loneliness and responsibility, as if this single bear's fate were an echo of countless others threatened by climate change and diminishing habitat. He wondered whether his presence was enough to tip the balance between life and death for the animal that had come to symbolize the delicate equilibrium of the Arctic ecosystem. Night fell completely, bringing an aurora that danced across the sky in rippling curtains of green and purple. James peeked out of his tent, shivering despite multiple layers of fleece and thermal gear. He gazed at the otherworldly spectacle overhead, feeling both insignificantly small and intricately connected to the cosmic display. The Arctic had a way of reminding him that life was both fleeting and beautiful, balanced on a knife's edge between wonder and devastation. He checked on the bear, which had curled into a loose ball, occasionally shifting to find a more comfortable position. The improvised bandage looked blood-stained, but at least the wound hadn't reopened completely. For a moment, James allowed himself to imagine the bear regaining strength, returning to the pack ice to hunt for seals, living out its life as nature intended. Then he pictured the alternative, finding it lifeless in the morning. That thought kept him awake for hours, huddled in his sleeping bag, listening for every breath or movement outside. When he finally drifted off, he dreamed of a vast white expanse under the aurora's glow, where a healthy polar bear stood tall, beckoning him forward with silent wisdom. In this dream, the boundaries between man and beast dissolved, replaced by a profound sense of unity. But dreams, he knew, were no guarantee of reality. At first light, James unzipped his tent to find the world coated in a fresh layer of snow. The wind had died down, and a gentle hush lay over the ice. He rushed to check on the bear, heart pounding with the fear that he might find it motionless. But to his astonishment, the bear was awake, watching him intently. The movement of its chest still appeared labored, but there was a spark in those dark eyes that hadn't been there the day before. Buoyed by the sight, James offered more rationed food, which the bear slowly accepted. He gently prodded the improvised bandage, noticing that while there was still some bleeding, it wasn't profuse. Relief washed over him, and he radioed for an update. This time, the dispatcher said a wildlife officer named Karen Thompson was on her way, estimated to arrive by midday on a specialized tracked vehicle. James breathed easier, hoping professional assistance might give the bear a fighting chance. As he waited, James continued to clean the wound, applying more antibiotic ointment. Each time, the bear seemed to tolerate his presence a bit more. It even relaxed its head on the snow after eating, occasionally eyeing James with a look that could almost be interpreted as curiosity. The sense of a silent pact between them grew stronger, no longer just man-saving beast, but a mutual exchange of trust. Shortly before noon, the low hum of an engine announced the arrival of the wildlife officer. A rugged, tracked vehicle, emblazoned with the Manitoba Conservation logo, came into view. Karen Thompson stepped out, her expression equal parts incredulity and admiration as she beheld James kneeling beside the bear. Karen was a tall, lean woman with a weathered face that spoke of countless hours spent in the Arctic. She approached slowly, her rifle slung over her shoulder and a tranquilizer gun in hand. "You sure know how to keep things interesting out here," she remarked to James, her voice carrying a note of professional detachment, softened by genuine concern. James quickly filled her in on the situation, how he had found the bear, its condition, and the minimal care he had been able to provide. Karen crouched at a safe distance, studying the bear through binoculars. The news was cautiously optimistic. The wound wasn't as severe as she initially feared, though infection was a concern. If they could sedate the bear safely and transport it to the makeshift animal care facility in Churchill, there was a chance it could recover. Together, they formulated a plan. Karen would administer a mild sedative, enough to calm the bear without causing undue stress on its already weakened body. Then, if the bear could walk, they would guide it onto a sturdy sled attached to her vehicle. It was a risky maneuver, fraught with the possibility of the bear panicking or reacting violently, but it seemed the only viable option. Karen readied her tranquilizer gun while James stood nearby, holding his breath. The dart found its mark in the bear's haunch, and the animal let out a startled growl before settling down, blinking in confusion. James's heart pounded. This was the most dangerous moment, when fear and adrenaline could override the bear's feeble condition. But it remained in place, apparently too exhausted to resist. After a few minutes, its eyelids drooped and its muscles relaxed. Very gently, James and Karen coaxed the bear onto the sled. The sight of its massive paws clinging to the edges brought home just how powerful it truly was, even in its weakened state. The creature's breath was shallow but steady, a mist forming around its muzzle. James couldn't help but feel a surge of protectiveness. He knew this was a wild animal, a top predator, yet at this moment it was also a vulnerable being relying on human compassion. Once secured, Karen started the vehicle's engine, and they began the slow journey back to Churchill. James rode in the back, keeping a close eye on the bear. The sedative's effect was strong, but any jolt or loud noise might rouse the animal. The journey felt surreal, as though he were ferrying some ancient guardian of the Arctic through a world that had become increasingly hostile to its existence. He prayed it would live to reclaim its rightful place on the ice. As they approached the outskirts of Churchill, a few curious onlookers gathered, cameras and phones in hand. It wasn't every day that someone saw a live polar bear being transported through town. Karen and James guided the sled carefully to a small facility that doubled as a temporary holding center for bears that wandered too close to human habitation. Under normal circumstances, these animals would be relocated deeper into the wilderness, but this was a special case. The facility's veterinarian, Dr. Rebecca Harlow, met them at the entrance. She wasted no time, directing them to a secure enclosure where she could examine the bear properly. The enclosure was essentially a large, reinforced cage with heated flooring and a few quiet corners for the bear to rest. Once the bear was inside, Dr. Harlow administered a more controlled dose of sedative, to fully examine the wound. She carefully removed James's makeshift bandage, pausing to glance at him with approval. "You did good work out there," she said quietly. "Could have saved its life." Relief flooded James, but so did a deep exhaustion. He felt as if every muscle had been tensed for days. Karen, noticing his weariness, clapped a hand on his shoulder. "Go on, get some rest," she said. "We'll take it from here. Dr. Harlow is one of the best in the field. If anyone can save this bear, it's her." James spent the night in a modest room provided by the research station in Churchill, though he barely slept. Images of the bear's wounded flank and those pleading, soulful eyes haunted him. Yet there was also a glimmer of hope this time. He wasn't alone in trying to help. Skilled hands were now doing everything possible. The following morning, James rushed to the facility at first light. He found Dr. Harlow in the middle of a thorough examination. The bear, still sedated, had the fourth drip attached to its foreleg, delivering fluids and antibiotics. The wound had been cleaned more thoroughly, and stitches now held the torn flesh together. The doctor explained that the infection was serious, but not insurmountable. If the bear could stabilize, gain some weight, and show signs of improved blood work, it might be released back into the wild within a few weeks or months. Standing beside the enclosure, James felt a wave of emotions. Gratitude that the bear was in capable hands, worry about the uncertain future, and a growing bond that defied logic. He recalled how, just days ago, he had merely hoped to see a polar bear at a distance. Now, he felt intimately involved in this creature's fate. It was as if they were linked by some invisible thread woven in the crucible of survival. In the days that followed, James found himself drawn to the facility whenever he had a spare moment. He documented the bear's progress, snapping photographs of each small milestone when it lifted its head without assistance, the first time it accepted food on its own, and when its breathing returned to a more normal rhythm. It became a point of fascination and emotional investment, not just for him but for the staff at the facility. They began calling the bear Hudson, after the nearby Hudson Bay. James had mixed feelings about naming a wild animal, but he understood it was human nature to personalize something you cared about. Gradually, Hudson's condition improved. The infection receded, and the wound began to heal. He started eating more, often devouring generous portions of fish provided by the facility. A sort of uneasy friendship emerged between Hudson and James, though it was mediated by the bars of the enclosure. Sometimes, when James approached, Hudson would lumber closer, sniffing the air and offering a low, rumbling greeting. Even though James knew the bear could never truly be domesticated, these brief interactions felt like windows into a shared language. With Hudson on the mend, the conversation turned to what would happen next. Dr. Harlow emphasized that Hudson was still too underweight to survive in the wild. The plan was to keep him until he reached a stable condition, then release him onto the pack ice, hopefully before it melted away for the summer. It was a race against time in a warming Arctic. Despite the outward calm of the facility, a growing tension gnawed at James. He could see how precarious the situation really was. Climate change had significantly shortened the period each year when the Hudson Bay was frozen solid enough for polar bears to hunt seals. Each year, bears lost more time to build up the fat reserves they needed to survive the ice-free summer season. Bears like Hudson, weakened and underweight, were especially vulnerable. James poured himself into his remaining field research, capturing data on the shrinking ice extent. But his focus often drifted back to Hudson. He couldn't shake the sense that saving this one bear was emblematic of a larger, more daunting challenge. If the habitat itself continued to erode, how many more bears would be lost? How many would starve or suffer injuries in desperate struggles for diminishing resources? The weight of these questions bore down on him, fueling a mix of urgency and despair. On a particularly cold evening, he visited the facility after hours. The staff allowed him inside for a brief moment to observe Hudson, who was now standing without difficulty in the enclosure. Their eyes met through the bars, and James felt that same primal recognition he'd felt out on the ice. He wondered what Hudson saw when he looked at him: a threat, a caregiver, or something beyond those simplistic categories. Perhaps the bear's capacity for understanding was as vast as the Arctic expanse, harboring complexities humans rarely acknowledged. Time seemed to blur as the weeks passed. James continued his research while checking in daily on Hudson's progress. The bear gained weight steadily, his fur regained some luster, and his playful side even began to emerge. One day, Dr. Harlow caught Hudson tossing a rubber buoy around his enclosure, batting at it like an oversized house cat. It was a heartwarming sight, a testament to resilience and the will to live despite adversity. Yet, as the date for Hudson's release approached, James felt an internal tug of conflict. Part of him dreaded the idea of saying goodbye, of never knowing for sure whether the bear would thrive once returned to the wild. Another part of him understood that captivity, no matter how caring, was no place for a healthy polar bear. The Arctic was where Hudson belonged, and James had to trust that the greater forces of nature would guide him. The day finally arrived. A specialized transport cage was brought in, large enough for Hudson to move freely, but secure enough to prevent any last-minute escape attempts. A sedation dose would be administered to minimize stress during the transfer. The plan was to airlift Hudson by helicopter to an area of thick sea ice far from any human settlements. From there, the bear would resume its ancient rhythms of hunting and survival. As the staff readied the equipment, James stood by Hudson's enclosure one final time. The bear ambled closer, huffing softly. In a gentle whisper, James said, "You were supposed to be just another research statistic, but you became so much more. Be strong out there, my friend." He knew it was sentimental to speak such words, but they carried a truth that he felt to his core. The transport operation was a blur of adrenaline. Hudson was sedated, rolled into the sturdy cage, and loaded onto a waiting helicopter. James secured his own harness inside the chopper, determined to see this journey through to the end. The roar of the helicopter blades contrasted sharply with the ethereal silence of the Arctic landscape. They flew over. Below, the Hudson Bay's icefield stretched like a fractured mirror, reflecting pale sunlight. They landed on a pristine stretch of pack ice, where the pilot carefully lowered the aircraft. Dr. Harlow administered a reversal drug to bring Hudson out of sedation. Gradually, the bear stirred, blinking at the sudden brightness. The side of the cage opened, and for a moment, Hudson just lay there, as though reluctant to leave the safety of the confines he'd known for weeks. Then, in a slow, purposeful motion, he stepped onto the ice. James and the team watched in hushed reverence. Hudson walked a short distance, turned to look back at them, and let out a deep exhalation. In that moment, James felt an indescribable bond, as if the bear was acknowledging the strange partnership that had allowed both man and beast to defy the odds. Then Hudson faced forward and lumbered into the white expanse, each footstep forging a path back to a life that was both perilous and free. The helicopter ride back was filled with a bittersweet silence. No one spoke much, each person lost in their own thoughts. James stared out the window, watching the endless ice fields roll past until they gave way to patches of open water. Releasing Hudson felt like both an accomplishment and a reminder of how little control humans truly wield over the fate of the wild. Yes, they had saved one life, but the greater challenges of habitat loss and climate change remained. Back in Churchill, James helped unload the gear and said his goodbyes to Dr. Harlow, Karen, and the rest of the staff. They parted with hugs and firm handshakes, promising to keep in touch about Hudson's status. Then, with a heavy heart, James returned to his own research station. There was data to finalize, reports to file. Yet he felt changed, as if the bond he'd formed with Hudson had awakened a new clarity of purpose in him. In the following days, James completed his work in Churchill and prepared to head back to Vancouver. Before leaving, he took one last walk along the frozen shoreline, letting the cold wind wash over him. In the distance, he thought he saw a white speck on the ice, but it could have been his imagination. Regardless, he felt a sense of peace. He had done everything in his power to help a creature whose survival was just as precarious as his own. In the Arctic, after all, life was precious, and even small acts of compassion resonated across the ice like ripples in a pond. Back home in Vancouver, James tried to slip into his old routines. He resumed his job with the conservation organization, meeting with donors, analyzing data, and writing proposals for future expeditions. But the memory of Churchill and Hudson was never far from his mind. His experience had galvanized him in a way that mere statistics never could. When he spoke at public forums or environmental conferences, he carried a renewed conviction. His words had weight, shaped by the tangible reality of having looked into the eyes of a dying polar bear and finding a spark of hope. He started receiving occasional updates from Dr. Harlow. She had installed a tracking device on Hudson's leg before the release, a small, non-invasive band that would eventually fall off. Through satellite pings, they could monitor the bear's general location. To James's delight, Hudson seemed to be moving steadily across the ice, following the migratory patterns typical for polar bears in that region. He traveled a good distance from the release point, suggesting he was strong enough to roam in search of seals. Each ping brought a surge of joy and relief, as though a friend was checking in from afar. One evening, while sifting through emails, James received a new update. Hudson had crossed onto an area of ice known for abundant seal populations. The data indicated healthy movement patterns, raising hopes that the bear was successfully hunting. For the first time in weeks, James allowed himself a full, unguarded smile. The journey wasn't over, not by a long shot, but Hudson was out there, living, and that felt like victory. As the months rolled on, James became something of a spokesperson for polar bear conservation. He was invited to speak at local schools, environmental symposiums, and even a few international conferences. The story of how he found Hudson wounded and near death and the subsequent rescue operation captured people's imaginations. Journalists picked up on the narrative. Man helps dying polar bear. You won't believe what happened next. Read the headlines. The storyline was compelling, a rare glimpse of compassion triumphing in a world that too often felt dominated by grim news about vanishing species. James was careful to maintain scientific rigor in his presentations. He didn't want Hudson's story to become an overly sentimental anecdote devoid of context. Instead, he used it as a gateway to discuss the broader issues: melting ice, shifting ecosystems, and the moral imperative to protect these majestic creatures. Yet, no matter how many charts and graphs he showed, it was always the personal testimony, the memory of looking into Hudson's eyes that moved audiences the most. In response, donations to the Canadian Wildlife Federation surged, and more volunteers signed up for Arctic conservation programs. James was amazed at the ripple effect. Yes, it was just one bear, but the narrative of saving Hudson seemed to spark a collective sense of responsibility and hope. He realized that sometimes a single story could indeed change the world, or at least nudge it in a better direction. During this period, James also underwent significant personal growth. He found himself questioning many of his assumptions about nature and humanity's role in it. He took up meditation, yearning for the kind of calm focus he'd felt when tending to Hudson's wounds on the ice. He spent more time outdoors near his home, hiking coastal trails and observing local wildlife. The sense of connection he felt with the natural world deepened, fueling both his passion for conservation and his own well-being. He also reflected on how fear had nearly stopped him from helping Hudson. In the moment, approaching an injured polar bear had seemed like sheer lunacy. Yet, guided by compassion, he'd overcome his terror, forging a bridge between two species that might otherwise remain adversaries. It was a potent reminder that fear often masked deeper truths about interdependence. The Arctic experience had taught him that genuine compassion could transcend even the most entrenched boundaries. Sometimes he caught himself daydreaming about returning to Churchill to see Hudson again, though he knew that was more fantasy than plan. Polar bears roam vast territories, and there was no guarantee Hudson would even be near the town. Besides, the bear was meant to live apart from human interference. Still, James carried the memory in his heart like a treasured keepsake, a testament to what was possible when empathy met courage. Half a year after Hudson's release, Dr. Harlow informed James that the bear's tracking device had finally stopped transmitting. It was expected. The device was designed to detach and fall off, avoiding any long-term impact on Hudson's mobility. While James felt a pang of disappointment, the updates had become a comforting ritual. He also knew this was a good sign. Hudson was fully back in the wild, free from any technological tethers. Without the regular pings, James found himself missing the quiet reassurance that Hudson was alive and well. Yet he took solace in the knowledge that no news might be the best news of all. The bear was free to follow its natural instincts, to hunt, roam, and perhaps even mate, contributing to the next generation of Arctic giants. James's own life proceeded along its winding path. He continued working on conservation projects, sometimes traveling to different parts of Canada and even other countries. But a part of him remained anchored to Churchill, where one extraordinary moment of compassion had altered the course of two lives, the bear's and his own. Whenever he felt disheartened by the magnitude of environmental challenges, he would recall the day he knelt in the snow, bandaging a wound on a creature that could have easily destroyed him. That memory was his talisman against despair. One crisp autumn morning, James opened his inbox to find an email from Karen Thompson, the wildlife officer. Attached was a photograph taken by a tourist near Churchill. It showed a polar bear standing on a rocky outcrop, gazing across the icy water. The bear's flank featured a faint scar, just visible if you looked closely. Karen had circled the scar in red, adding a caption, "Could this be our Hudson?" James stared at the image, his heart pounding. The scar was in roughly the same location as Hudson's wound. The shape and size of the bear seemed to match. Of course, there was no definitive proof. Many bears carried scars. But the possibility sent a thrill through him. He emailed Karen back, joking about how they should put out a welcome mat for their old friend. She responded that local guides had spotted this particular bear a few times, describing it as healthy and surprisingly sociable for a polar bear, though it maintained its distance. True or not, the idea that Hudson might still roam those shores gave James a renewed sense of purpose. It reminded him that while the world remained fraught with environmental crises, success stories were still possible if people were willing to act. In the years that followed, James became a well-known advocate for polar bear conservation. His experience rescuing Hudson had become a legend in environmental circles, fueling documentaries, articles, and panel discussions. He stood before large audiences in auditoriums and conferences, sharing not just the harrowing details, but also the emotional resonance of that encounter. He would pause to let people absorb the moment when he described cleaning the wound of a beast that outweighed him fivefold, risking everything to offer a glimmer of hope. His personal life also evolved. He met a fellow researcher, Sophie, who shared his passion for the polar regions. They bonded over long conversations about ecology and eventually fell in love. Together, they traveled to Antarctica for a penguin study and to Greenland to examine glaciers. Yet, no matter where they went, James's heart always drifted back to the Arctic. He spoke of returning to Churchill someday, perhaps to volunteer at the same facility that saved Hudson's life. Sophie agreed that it would be a worthy trip, especially if they could contribute to the ongoing research and conservation work. In quieter moments, James would reflect on how one act of courage and kindness had rippled outward. It was a testament to the interconnectedness that Noah Kapik had spoken of years ago. In the Arctic, everything relied on everything else, an unbroken chain of survival and support. And sometimes it only took one person, one catalyst, to spark a larger change. Finally, the opportunity arose. A philanthropic foundation offered James and Sophie a grant to study polar bear migration patterns near Churchill. It was a dream come true, a chance for James to return to the place where his life had been irrevocably altered. They arrived in late autumn, when the sea ice was just beginning to form along the shore of Hudson Bay. The town felt both familiar and new, as if greeting an old friend after many seasons apart. James reconnected with Karen and Dr. Harlow, both of whom were still hard at work, preserving the region's wildlife. Their hugs were warm, their smiles genuine. "We always knew you'd come back," Karen teased. "The Arctic gets under your skin." The research itself involved tagging and tracking several bears, monitoring their movement as the ice advanced. James and Sophie ventured out on snowmobiles and specialized tundra vehicles, scanning the horizon with binoculars. Each time they encountered a bear, James felt a flutter of excitement. He couldn't help but wonder, would he see Hudson again, scar and all? The rational part of him knew the odds were slim. Yet he carried the hope in his heart, a secret wish that refused to be extinguished. In early December, James and Sophie were scanning the ice one morning when they spotted a lone bear in the distance. Something about its posture seemed oddly familiar, a steady, unhurried gait, a slight tilt of the head. James's pulse quickened. Sophie nudged him, noticing his excitement. As they approached, the bear lifted its head, watching them with cautious curiosity. Even from 100 yards away, James could see a faint scar on its right flank. His heart soared. While polar bear researchers typically maintain a strict no-interference protocol, the bear seemed to recognize the approaching vehicle in some primal way. It stood still, as if waiting, allowing them a closer look. Through binoculars, James confirmed the scar's location and shape matched exactly where Hudson's wound had been. Tears blurred his vision, and he handed the binoculars to Sophie, who gasped in astonishment. They watched Hudson, now thickly muscled and covered in a healthy coat of fur, calmly gaze back at them under the northern sun. For a moment, predator and humans were locked in a silent exchange, each acknowledging the other's place in this vast tapestry of life. James felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude, as if the cycle had come full circle. He had once found Hudson near death. Now here the bear stood, a living testament to resilience, to the power of a single compassionate act. After a minute or two, Hudson turned away and lumbered across the ice, a monarch returning to his domain. James and Sophie sat in respectful silence, letting the enormity of the moment sink in. That evening, as the polar twilight enveloped Churchill, James reminisced about his first arrival, how he had come seeking data, facts, numbers. In the end, he found a story of a bond forged through trust, a story that transcended the usual divide between human and beast. In saving Hudson, James had discovered a piece of himself he never knew was missing. And out there, under the shimmering aurora, he felt more certain than ever that their destinies were intertwined, each a vital thread in the ever-evolving narrative of the Arctic wilderness. Consider how one person's act of courage and compassion sparked a powerful ripple effect, transforming not only a bear's fate, but the man himself. This story reminds us that in a world threatened by change, hope can be found in the small moments when we choose empathy over fear. If you feel inspired by James's journey and Hudson's survival, help amplify their message. Hit that like button to show your support. Share this video to raise awareness about wildlife conservation, and subscribe to stay connected with more stories that celebrate our connection to nature. Together, we can foster a world where compassion leads to real change, one life at a time. Remember, whether we're watching from our screens or stepping onto the ice ourselves, each of us holds the power to make a difference. So be bold, be kind, and let hope guide you forward. Now is the time to act.